Well, that was quite a journey. From the Danish Social Democrats via Troels Andersen to Kandinsky, modernism, Malevich, a life story for Netflix, Kristoffer and his grandmother, Putin's nose and grandmother's face, and my goodness, we really got around. And then Birgitte, with your presentation of, I don't want to call it child abuse, but close by, and it was fascinating. All presentations were fascinating, and now I want to give you all a chance to follow up either on some of your own presentations, what you didn't get to say. I hate my job, by the way. And you hate me for interrupting you and getting after you, but that's the conditions, okay. But you will have a chance. We'll take a round here at the panel. You can comment or you can follow up on any of your points inspired by what the others said, or you can comment on each other comments. And then after that round, I will turn to the audience and let them react and comment and take it away. So please go ahead, anyone.
All right, I can begin.
Sure.
I showed the images to conclude with the Roskilde High School, the public high school, Roskilde Social High School. And it was demolished, as I said, which for me is a symbol of what happened to many of these murals that I've shown and talked about, that from the 50s and 60s, they were found obsolete. The figurative, realistic language that they used was found obsolete. It was too closely tied with, for instance, Germany and the Soviet Union and the collective. So they kind of disappeared, and I think right now in these years there's a tendency for art historians and historians to relook at these practices. Anyway, so Kristoffer, I was thinking, as an artist today, how do you deal with the present political situation? I mean, what was criticized at these older murals that I'm talking about was that they were maybe too didactic, too pedagogical, too straightforward, banal, and so on and so on. How do you approach, for instance, Putin and so on?
But maybe also that they were very aligned with power. To realize big public murals takes big public backing. So there's a kind of a pendulum swing for me. Like if you align, you can realize big, you can build big, you can make huge murals. But you then also become identified with the time and the power structures that realize them. I don't know if that makes sense as an answer. So for me, like, I think I'm probably more invested in the marginal. I'm very inspired by Soviet non-conformist artists and people who work within conditions that they're critical of and try not to channel the powers that be, if that makes sense. So the question I ask myself is, so I'm critical of everything. How can I still do something? So the Soviet artists who make exhibitions inside the fridge, so the security services can't tell whether it's food or it's art. And by that way, they sort of sidestep some of the problems of being what they're able to do, what they're not able to do. All those strategies are things that appeal to me much more than getting into a position of realizing a big public mural. So this kind of idea of the marginal and what you can do from that position is interesting to me specifically. And I think that's not something that all artists are interested in, but that's at least a segment. And for me, I see that also, like, at some point you have a single artist whose work is on all the air train stations in Copenhagen, and you get so fed up. Just like, I don't want any more Kirkeby. I'm never going to look at that again. So there's a certain sort of saturation point as well, and I think it's important to not think of it as static, but dynamic. It's a dynamic system where you change positions. If you align yourself, if you have power, if you have agency, it will change.
But I think it's not just an ideological thing. I think it's a general art historical thing, because even Paul Gernes, for instance, who did several large pieces, but usually not sponsored by very powerful people, but by local dentists or local football clubs or tennis clubs or whatever. But all that kind of public art is fragile. It's not protected. You could always get rid of it. That's really... Perhaps it oughtn't to be like that. That if it's public, you can just remove it.
Birgitte,
That's
you want
another
to pitch in?
question.
No, it was just a very one of the first examples you showed on the slides of the crematorium. It reminded me so much of the previous talk and the images of the metro stations in Kharkiv with its open. so it's it was just an association. But Hermansen from Roskilde Højskole, he was organizing an exhibition of Soviet graphic art just a year before in 1930. So I think he was also very close to
The Communist Party.
Yeah,
yes, he was.
And it leads to this question of can we look at these murals today with innocence, or what about this? Do you think it's innocent art?
Well, they differ. Some of them are more directly political than others. I still think it's important to read them in the context that were made. We can't just take that apart. And I think for me that's also what makes it interesting, that these artists were actually commenting on the situation in the 20s and in the 30s. And I still believe in Denmark, as I was suggesting, that most of this mural public art did not attack the politics directly. They did it in a more symbolic way, and I don't think very many of them were, as I said, right-wing or left-wing. I think Hermansen is actually one of the most obvious political murals that we have. There are a few others, but when you look at, for instance, Wilhelm Lundstrøm in the Frederiksberg Svømmehal, it's hard to decide what is that. I don't find that works very political, but I find it definitely trying to build a better world.
There's also something interesting about how a lot of this kind of heroic mass spectacle imagery lived for a long time in computer games, in role-playing games. So one way of putting it would be that it found somewhere else to inhabit, and it's been sleeping, and I feel like it's coming back. So instead of having this sort of sequential art history, maybe that things flow into different categories. They're not regarded as high culture anymore. It becomes part of low culture. Then it's not in the museum. But I feel like I grew up with all these heroic images that are very much the same, but just in computer games.
Or in film.
Or in film.
But since our panel is named or called Russian or Soviet Danish Reflections, so do you, any of you see any influence from, I think that the closest would be the murals, that there would be a connection. Can we establish an influence at least?
Oh, I'm sure. Many of the magazines from the 20s and 30s were definitely in contact with Soviet art. Tania, I'm sure you can elaborate also on this. But definitely there were connections, definitely.
And a lot of the artists, I think, were actually fellow travelers, if not actually members of the Communist Party. They were definitely fellow travelers, I think. But that doesn't mean they should be destroyed. I think it's very important, on the contrary, to keep these signs of the times. I mean, it's very... We don't need to look at them with an innocent eye, but they remind us of history. I think that's quite important.
I don't recall that Hans Schärfe did any political murals. Did he?
Actually, he did, Samuel. Yes, actually he did in a children care home in Carlsberg, the Carlsberg Brewery. Those paintings are today at Copenhagen University.
And was he influenced? I mean, he was a declared communist. He never made a secret out of that. But was there a connection also? Was he influenced by any of his Soviet colleagues?
He was, and he was also criticized by, for instance, Paul Henningsen for being way too political and way too Marxist in his way of dealing with capitalism and the modern society, towards which he was very, very skeptical, of course. Although in those magazines, Kritisk Revue and Clarté and several of the magazines in the 20s and 30s, that there was a very anti-capitalistic, anti-USA attitude towards that individualism that they often located in the United States.
But I mean, look at Schaeffi's children's books. Even when he explains nature, I mean, you get sort of some very capitalist vultures there. So, I mean, you can be a propagandist in many different ways.
Did any of what you were showing, Birgitte, influence any Danish illustrator or artist in that same spirit as we are talking about here?
Well, I don't know about the living newspapers, but for example, the war newspapers definitely did. There's a well-known Danish pedagogue, Torben Gregersen, who also had a huge collection of Soviet children's books that he later donated to the Danish Design Museum, or what is today the Danish Design Museum. So we owe a lot of our book collections in Denmark to some of these cultural radical pedagogues who went to the Soviet Union and who also exhibited. I think there were like at least 5 exhibitions during the 1920s in Copenhagen of Soviet Russian avant-gardist children's books.
But no application of school kids or kindergarten kids?
No, but lots of Danish children's books inspired by those Soviet children's books, because they were visually very advanced, really.
Yeah, but also with the kids' bodies, that's what I mean.
Well,
did anybody pick it up here?
I don't know about the living newspaper performances, but I think that some of the trends about physical culture and the importance of doing sports and gymnastics and acrobatics, that is also characteristic for children's culture. If you think of De Unges Idræt and especially in the later decade in the 1930s, where you also start to get Hitlerjugend and so on.
I was gonna say, because is there an undercurrent of sort of fascistic attitudes through this that have been influencing art forms?
I think it's across the political spectrum. There was also like social democratic youth movements in the 1930s, and we had the fascist youth culture in Germany and Italy in the 1930s, and the communist socialist in the Soviet Union. So I think there was a general mobilization of children and young people leading up to the Second World War, and there was a militarization of childhood going on, but that was not a monopoly of fascism.
Let me turn to the audience and see if you have any questions or comments. Please raise a hand, and then when you get a mic, please introduce yourself. 1, 2, and 3. Please remember your numbers, okay? Don't take it personally, though. Number 1 here on the 3rd row.
Thank you very much. Christian Hanberg, arts historian from the University of Copenhagen. A little comment from also the arts historian side, leading to a question or into the discussion. Taking up on the 1930s murals, and I think you're very right at pointing out that this was an international movement across Europe and across ideologies. And I think none of the Danish major artists of the modernist actually traveled the Soviet Union or affiliated themselves with the Soviet ideals. It's such a complex story how the ideas and styles were still influential. There would have been some exhibitions at Den Frie of both Soviet and of Imperial Russian art in the interwar years that is still very little studied. Then when we have a proper socialist realism, I think it very much came from Paris. Victor Brockdorff, for instance, who did some full-on socialist realist murals for the communist organizations for DKP. I think there was a summer cottage up in northern Zealand where some of his murals were discovered recently. I think he got his inspiration from Foucheron and some committed realists in Paris, and also from going to Paris, so you don't necessarily become a cosmopolitan modernist painter. You can also be a committed communist by going to Paris. And then relations, Danish-Soviet relations in the Cold War years, in the post-war era, is a complex one with many phases and often a lack of ability to establish contacts. Denmark was politically relatively proactive in establishing relations with the Soviet Union. As one of the first countries, a cultural exchange agreement was made in 1961 and celebrated with an exhibition of the all-Soviet annual exhibition from the Soviet Academy of Arts in Charlottenborg 62, which was heavily debated and detested by most of the Danish press, except for Land og Folk. But some responses were also made. For instance, Danish Artists Association Corner was able to do a large exhibition presenting Danish art through their figurative, I guess the opposite of non-conformist style in 1979, being shown at the Art Academy Museum in Leningrad and in Riga, I think. So it's so curious to think of Danish art as such being represented by Corner, with all due respect, some excellent artists there, but a very different perception that, for instance, what came from X-Skolen in the late 70s. And also that it was such a rare occasion of an exhibition of Danish art being presented in the Soviet Union. I'm curious to see more examples, and I think some more would come in the late 80s. However, I think an overlooked and little episode that would be important to see is that an exhibition of non-conformist Soviet artists from Moscow was presented 2 places in Denmark in 1970 after an exhibition of Danish design that my co-researcher Julia has worked intensively on. That led to the opportunity to present 12 Moscow artists in Copenhagen from the non-conformist circles, I think in Helligåndskirken and in Roskilde in 1970. So just some mentioning, sorry if I got into detail about what was actually carried out through mainly the post-war era between Denmark and the Soviet Union. And maybe also if you would like to follow up, if you know some more examples, that would be incredibly interesting.
Anybody want to respond to that? Birgitte?
But yeah, it's a bit. I don't know. Right now, I work on book exhibitions that took place in the late 1970s, international book exhibitions, and in the early 80s. And it's a bit somehow surprising that we should look to the early Reagan years for a kind of hope for intercultural exchange when we think about the present situation. So although we talk of the Iron Curtain and so on, it seems like throughout the Cold War period there have been mutual contacts and exchanges across East-West divides. And now it feels like that history is winding back somehow. Yeah.
And I think there are always numerous, not necessarily, but also, I mean, there are always numerous examples of unofficial, non-official contacts. I mean, there were lots of Fluxus contacts across the wall, and I mean, something like mail art was very popular in Eastern Europe. I don't know many Russian examples. I think there are very many Polish examples, for example. Czech and
Polish art exhibitions, both in Denmark and Poland, so much more exchanges.
Yes.
For instance, Poland.
Yes, yes. But I mean, mail art was something that could sort of fly under censorship and so on. So lots of, I think, unofficial channels were always working throughout the Cold War period as well.
Number 2.
My name is Dana Gavilina. I'm a Ukrainian artist, and therefore this panel went quite difficultly for me. I was feeling a bit confused during the Kristoffer's talk, which contained actually very much of attention and sentiment towards a Russian identity and also a good-hearted humor. And I didn't quite understand how it was integrated into the topic of war in Ukraine, which is, above other things, the topic of the conference. But a question that I have is to Tania, and I wanted to ask you, how do you relate to the term Russian avant-garde that you use in your talk? Because it is still quite, this question is quite acute, the critique of the term Russian in Russian avant-garde. Because if you do a very simple thing and look on the list of the prominent Russian avant-gardists, not really many names were actually Russian first. And many of them were immigrants from other countries, and they were sometimes immigrants in the first generation and not even in the third. And starting with Malevich, whom you also turned to in your talk, who was actually born in Kiev to a Polish family. Yeah. And the other side of this question is actually how many of them used Russian to describe their own identity. Did they really say they were Russian ones, or they were internationalists? Sorry.
Thank you. Kristoffer, would you like to respond first?
Yes, and I think I feel a little out of place, as you said, as well, and I completely understand. But I think for me there are 2 points, maybe. One is humor is also needed in dark times, so I found maybe that by injecting this kind of nonconformist humor would be good in the context. So that's my consideration. And I think the other thing I thought about was how much of this in Denmark we speak from not knowing, how much propaganda, how much image politics we're subjected to, how difficult it is I go on Telegram to Google Translate weird Ukrainian channels to try and get direct information, because it's so difficult, how much is lost in the image politics, how much focus there is, how tired I get myself of what some people have called West-splaining, Americans talking about what we should do in Ukraine about Ukrainian. So I felt like it was important to keep it on my side of the fence, the things that I don't know, if that makes sense. And I think most Danes, we don't have direct access. So we only have these phantasmagorical labyrinth of images of Putin and just talk about this man and how much. So to talk about the image politics, how much is invested in the images we see, to talk about how we are manipulated, how people, I find it amazing that the CIA and the Pentagon do year-long studies of Putin's face and come up with what they say are facts. And the images they analyze are Kremlin's official photographs that were already doctored by the time so they're analyzing a fabrication. So it's a fabrication. So these weird, and I feel like lots of the discussion about Ukraine here locally is like that, like a phantasmagorical mirror that is very difficult to get real information, which is why it's so exciting to have you here to talk about it. But also it would be disingenuous for me to say that I know anything really about the conflict, speaking from my armchair in Denmark with my Russian grandmother. But the best thing I can do is to put it forward and to say there's something weird about the image we're given, the stream of weird images, the surveillance technologies, how they're used, so on. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. I hope it can be continued. Tania?
Yes, when I was referring to the Russian avant-garde, that's how Troels Andersen talked about it in the 60s, when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and it was all...
But not Russia.
No, but it was talked... No, yeah, it was talked about as the Russian avant-garde. But I mean, it's completely the same thing with the avant-garde in Paris. I mean, most of the people who made the avant-garde in Paris were never French. I mean, it was people from all over the world. I think the avant-garde has always been transnational. And I know that Malevich is Ukrainian, and his writings were translated from Ukrainian into Russian before Troels Andersen could translate them into Danish and then afterwards into English.
Excuse me, at least you need a mic, and you are not... I have another question.
So maybe a note.
No, you need to use the microphone, please.
He wrote in his passport that he's Ukrainian before he was actually hardly, attacked by Soviet. So he had identity as Ukrainian.
But I'm not sure that was... I mean, anyway, when I look at what Troels Andersen wrote in the 60s, he and that's what I referred to, he talked about it as the Russian avant-garde.
So, number 3?
I don't think one would do that today, of course. But he did in the 60s.
Final question. Can we take another 2 minutes?
Several questions.
We are out of time, but please go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to be very fast. Actually, my first question was the one that Dana asked already, and I think almost everyone here agrees that the term Russian avant-garde is very problematic, and there should be a lot of discussions of what to do with the field of Soviet studies and so on, and the term definitely should go. So it's great that we had this discussion. And my question is to Birgitte. I think that probably, again, speaking about the avant-garde, you brought the example of the Czech collaboration in this abeceda, and it's interesting for me that you brought it together with this acrobatics and the live newspapers from the Soviet context. And I wondered how much it actually stands together. This experimental dance initiated to a great extent actually by Mayerova, so the only woman in this trio, and the power, the authorities guided mass acrobatics. And at the same time, of course, when we think about all these mass arrangements as letters, as messages, of course, it's very important to problematize it the way you did brilliantly. But another context could be the mass ornament in the capitalist society in the 20s and further, and then cheerleading. My friend, a colleague suggested that if you think about cheerleading, we hardly associate it with dictatorial politics and any authoritarianism, but there can be some formal references, so it's just to add a little bit of problematization without dismissing, and again, that all can be provocative and debated against. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these perspectives, and I certainly agree that the mass culture in the West also is an important source of an important source of influence on these phenomena.
On this note, I want to thank you all. You were all great. All of you had issues with the timing, but hard to blame you for that, because what every one of you had to present and talk about was fascinating. And I can tell you, I wanted to hear much more and in much more detail from each single of you. And I regret that we didn't have more time to go explore and go into more depth on each single presentation. But I will say that if everybody in the audience shares that sentiment and feels like me, the panel has achieved what we set out to achieve. So I think we should give the panel a hand and thank them for their contributions. Thank you.